You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Erectile dysfunction is one of the most common sexual difficulties that men encounter, and it can be very distressing to them and to their partners. The good news is that ED is highly treatable, but in order to address it effectively, we really need to understand what causes it in the first place so that we're not just pursuing a Band-Aid solution. So in today's show, we're going to explore the hidden causes of ED and delve into some of the psychological reasons why it occurs. For example, we'll explore how early attachment wounds can manifest as erectile difficulties later in life. We'll also talk about how the loss of erotic polarity in relationships and performance anxiety can trigger erectile problems. In addition, we'll discuss the role of porn in ED. It's widely assumed that porn causes erection issues, but does it really? We'll delve into what the research actually says. I am joined once again by Dr. Nazanin Moali, a licensed clinical psychologist, ASEX certified sex therapist, and host of the internationally acclaimed Sexology podcast. Based in Los Angeles, she leads a successful private practice where she helps individuals and couples deepen emotional intimacy, overcome sexual challenges, and create more fulfilling relationships. This is going to be another fascinating episode. Stick around, and we're going to jump in right after the break. Join leading researchers and experts for insightful presentations and discussions on the evolving landscape of sex and aging at the Kinsey Institute 2025 Specialty Intensive and Symposium this fall. This event will take place on October 4th, 2025, with both online and in-person attendance options available. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org. And to stay up to date on the latest events and educational opportunities, follow at Kinsey Institute on the socials. Okay, Nazanin, let's talk about erectile dysfunction. So before we get into what causes it, let's talk about how common it is. So you're a sex therapist. Do you think it's safe to say that ED is probably the single most common sexual dysfunction that men experience? Is that what you see in your practice?
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that many people have erectile unpredictability. It's not even erectile dysfunction because of all of this negative messaging that we get that like, oh, your penis needs to work on demand. A big part of the population, they think they have erectile dysfunction, when in reality, it's erectile unpredictability. But you're right. That's the number one reason people come to my practice, at least.
Yeah, and I think it's important, and I've talked about this on the show before, to distinguish sexual dysfunctions from sexual disappointments. A disappointment is something that happens. It's like a one-time thing, and sex doesn't go quite the way that you want it to, or your body doesn't perform or do that thing that you want it to. And just because that happened doesn't mean that you have a sexual dysfunction. But when people experience sexual disappointments, they often start spiraling, and it can create these feelings of shame. And then they have convinced themselves that they have ED, when in reality, it was just a sexual disappointment. So it's something that, because there's so much pressure to perform, that when something doesn't go quite right or quite the way that we were hoping, that it can become this very self-defeating thing. And then that can actually set the stage for a real sexual dysfunction, because then every time you approach sex in the future, you start having all these anxious thoughts and feelings, and you're worried that you're not going to be able to get it up or stay hard or have an orgasm. And then that becomes a whole problem in and of itself. So a sexual disappointment can actually turn into a sexual dysfunction if you're not handling it appropriately. Now, in terms of how common ED is, so we recently conducted a nationally representative survey at the Kinsey Institute of 2,000 adults, and we always ask people about sexual problems and difficulties on these surveys. And overall, we found that about 12% of men in our sample reported erectile difficulties in the last year, but the number varies a lot based on age, ranging from 6.5% of men ages 18 to 24 to 18.3% of men over the age of 65. So guys over the age of 65 are 3 times more likely than Gen Z men to be reporting erectile problems. But those numbers actually struck me as being a little bit low compared to other data I've seen. And I can't help but wonder if widespread access to ED medications might be pushing this down. You know, we didn't ask people if they'd been diagnosed with ED, just whether they'd had erectile difficulties in the previous year. So if they're being treated for it or they're taking ED meds, they might not be having any problems, and therefore that's not showing up in our data as erectile issues. So, in other words, since ED meds are so easy to get these days, it's probably masking the true scope of the problem. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
I 100% agree because what's interesting is that sometimes they have very young clients, even in mid 20s, that they take these medication as an insurance,
Yep.
right? That's why that it's so unfortunate how people are misinformed when it comes to best practices when it comes to using this medication and how to address it so you wouldn't feel that you have to rely on it.
Yeah. And I think what you said there is so true about a lot of people taking it kind of as this insurance policy. It's like, well, I'm worried that, occasionally I have a sexual disappointment. And so I want to make sure that doesn't happen. So they take the medication. And I think there are lots of people who don't have true erectile dysfunction in the sense of meeting the threshold for a clinical diagnosis who are taking these meds, and telehealth companies are making it so easy to access it that I think in some ways it's probably being overused. And I'm not saying I'm against these meds at all. I think that they can be very, very helpful for a lot of people in dealing with erectile dysfunction and also just in terms of building up your sexual self-confidence. But my concern with them is that sometimes people become overly reliant on them to the point where they're not really dealing with some of the underlying issues that are getting in the way of them having good sex. And, just having a functional penis is not enough to have, great and amazing sex. So I just wish we wouldn't ignore the psychology in all of this. So, in terms of what causes ED, we hear so much in the media and on social media about how porn is a growing source of the problem. And in fact, we're increasingly seeing the term porn induced erectile dysfunction thrown around, despite the fact that it's not a scientific or medical diagnosis. In fact, in studies looking at this topic, they actually don't find support for the idea that guys who use more porn actually report more erectile issues. And instead, what they find is that guys who use more porn actually report fewer erectile issues, which might be because men who are using more porn just kind of have bigger sexual appetites to begin with. It's not to say that watching porn gives you better erections, right? I think we're just talking about a selection effect for, a group of particularly horny men. But I wanted to get your take on this. Why do you think people are so quick to blame porn for men's erection problems when, the evidence just isn't really there?
Well, in order for us to understand what's happening underneath that cause us to have erectile unpredictability or erectile dysfunction, it requires more of a advanced way of gathering information. So I feel exactly what you talked about, that we're scapegoating porn to all of the issues. People say that my partner doesn't want to have sex with me because he has porn addiction. Right? My partner avoid having sex, or they have this unconventional or kinky sexual appetite. It's because they watch porn. Because it's an easy way for people to blame the challenge to something that's an external factors. But in reality, we have to get to understand what's happening and what purpose porn serves in these situations in order for us to know that what are some of the psychological or even relational dynamic that cause us to experience erectile dysfunction. So I think it's very easy to blame the external factor that's society. Everywhere we go, everyone is watching porn, and everyone, like I would say, majority of people are against porn, which is like, to me, it's very ironic.
Yeah. It is a funny thing that most people watch porn, but also most people are against it, if you look at public opinion polls. So there's a little bit of a hypocrisy going on there. But yeah, porn is something that I think is very easy to blame for any and all sexual problems. And, certainly I do see negative sides of porn, especially when it becomes like the default form of sex education, because porn is entertainment. It's not education. So there are certainly issues with pornography. But, even if we got rid of all the porn, we're still going to have problems, right? ED is still going to exist. ED existed before we had the modern era of porn on all of our smartphone devices. So it's easy to blame porn, but it's not necessarily the right thing to blame. So, there are lots of things that can cause erectile dysfunction and also those erectile disappointments and unpredictability. And we've talked about a lot of the usual suspects on the show before, including cardiovascular issues, chronic health problems, performance anxiety. But today, I want to dive into some of the hidden causes that aren't discussed as often. So to that end, let's talk a little bit about attachment wounds and how they can potentially underlie ED. So what can you tell us about how unresolved early attachment trauma or current insecure relationship dynamics, how can these things play a role in erectile difficulties?
Our attachment style plays a huge role in on how we connect relationally and sexually with others. Majority of people, they know about attachment styles, but for people that are not familiar with it, attachment is based on the connection we had with our primary caregiver as a child, whether they were consistent or not, or if we had inconsistency or lack of their presence for a number of different reasons. It could be things that they were not emotionally present or they had life circumstances. But based on those patterns, later on, that is a blueprint that helps us to connect, or we use unconsciously to connect with others unless we address it through therapy. And for many people, they say 50% of people have a secured attachment style. So a secure attachment style is what it is, what we call a secure, that you get attracted, connected to someone that's available, they're consistent, and that can be very strengthening for our sex life. But there are other types of attachment style that can get activated when we are in relationship with certain type of people. One of the common ones that I see is connected to erectile dysfunction is anxious attachment style. So in these types of attachment style, people get very hypervigilant around if the partner is emotionally available or not, or even the partner, if they're withdrawing, that creates anxiety, that triggers self-doubt, and that can really impact our performance. Because in reality, we are in different season of life. Maybe our partner is more available emotionally or give us more reassurance. The hope is that we all have strong ego strength, that we can understand that, okay, this could be more about this context versus about me. And when people have anxious attachment style and the attachment get triggered because of what's happening in the relationship, they are more at this fight and flight space. And it's hard for them to be able to perform, to be able to be at the place that they can be sexually confident. So that's one type that I see that cause an issue. Another interesting thing is with avoidant attachment style. So with avoidant attachment style, the dynamic is that when the emotional piece is getting stronger, when the lover-to-lover emotional connections deepen, people with avoidant attachment style, they get turned off. Because in order for them to be able to have good sexual experiences, there needs to be more that kind of like casual, non-emotionally deep connection. So when you are with someone that like the emotional connection is deeper, they might experience lack of desire, and lack of desire could lead to erectile unpredictability. So these are the two common patterns that I see in people's sexual encounters that could be connected to their attachment style.
I think there's some research that backs up this idea that these attachment wounds, especially stemming from early childhood experiences, can play a big role in our sexual function in adulthood. So, for example, in one study I wrote about on the blog several years ago that was published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, they found that men who had experienced attachment disrupting events in childhood, such as parental alcoholism, parental death, and growing up in a house with severe marital discord, they had much higher rates of ED than men who didn't experience those kinds of issues. So when you have early life experiences that interfere with development of secure attachment, that does seem to have some important implications for sexual function later on. If you're anything like me, maybe you've noticed that your libido is a little bit higher in the summer compared to other times of year. And there's actually a scientific explanation for this. Exposure to sunlight actually increases testosterone. So if you've been feeling a little hot and bothered lately, make the most of it with Beducated, the #1 online platform for sexual health and happiness. With over 100 expert-led courses, Beducated will help you to explore new sensations, build deeper intimacy, and really turn up the heat in the bedroom. No matter your level of sexual experience, your sexual orientation or gender, or your relationship status, there's something here for you. One course you'll definitely want to explore is Ecstatic Sex. This course will teach you practical ways to deepen your intimate connection and have more fulfilling sexual experiences. For example, you'll learn how to improve your sexual communication skills and create a safe space to discuss your wants and desires. You'll learn how to slow down and savor pleasure during both masturbation and partnered play. This course will also teach you what you need to know about multiple orgasms and riding the waves of pleasure. Beducated is where toe-curling pleasure meets expert-backed education. Get 60% off the yearly pass by using my last name, Laymiller, as the coupon code. This is an incredible deal, and your discount is locked in for life. Try Beducated risk-free with a 14-day money-back guarantee. Check the show notes for the link, and be sure to use my last name to get your discount. And remember, pleasure is a skill, and now is the season to sharpen it with Beducated. All right, so beyond attachment issues, let's talk about performance pressure. So a lot of men view their sexual performance as an indicator of their masculinity. So when you start having performance problems, it can become a big threat to your self-image. So talk to us about that. Where does all this pressure come from, and how does it affect ED?
That is such a common challenge that many people have. And it comes from our childhood, kind of messaging that we receive. We all have our own unique experiences, and how we learn to cope with those experiences is for us to create this beliefs and, in a way, guidebook on how are we going to navigate life and how are we going to do relationships. For a group of people, because of the experiences they had early on or even their temperament, they have this intermediate belief that things need to be perfect in order for it to be worth pursuing, or I need to be perfect, otherwise people would not want to be around me, or things need to be perfect, or otherwise I'll be a failure. So these are the way that people kind of like, these are the scripts and the beliefs that they have. And it shows up in so many different aspects of their life, at work, at relationship. So when they carry the same belief in the bedroom, in a way, it sets them for failure, because as human beings, we all will have some challenges around sexual performance, arousal. Even when you're healthy, it's common to not be able to perform in a way that you wanted to perform, right? Then that can lead to lots of disappointment for these individuals, kind of feeling that maybe I'm not good enough, if I'm not performing enough, or I'm not getting a hard erection, my partner might not be interested in having sex with me. And I think oftentimes for these people, since now we are in a society that values optimization, biohacking, we heard all of these other strategies, so add more pressure. Therefore, when they're not able to show up in a way that in their mind it's perfect, then that leads to them to feel discouraged. And it can turn to this vicious cycle of, if I'm not able to, or I cannot project doing my best, therefore I don't want to engage.
Yeah, I think what you described there pretty well encapsulates what's going on here when it comes to all this performance pressure and anxiety that men experience. And that pressure comes from a lot of different sources. Sometimes it's from our partners, but it's also from the media that we consume, from pornography, from information that we see on social media. And it leads us to kind of overinterpret these sexual disappointments and what it all means. So yet another factor that can contribute to erectile difficulties is the loss of erotic energy in long-term relationships. So tell us a little bit about that. Why is there often a loss of erotic polarity in long-term relationships and marriages, and how does that affect men's sexual performance?
Sexual tension and that polarity can help people to build arousal, and they can connect with their erotic energy. But many times when we are in a long-term relationship, or we're in a relationship that there's lots of familiarities, or we feel like I really know what my partner thinks, we have no individual erotic mind or activities, that can lead to people feel that they might experience this lower desire. They think about, okay, I hear it all the time from my clients, I don't want to have sex with my family member. So when that happens, sometimes we don't have the tools to communicate that with a partner, because talking about sex requires lots of vulnerability, and it can be an art to be able to communicate that lack of desire with our partner in a way that doesn't feel you're rejecting them. So sometimes people not have those difficult conversations and they're not giving the feedback. Therefore, they are trying to continue making it work in a way that, like, having sex with someone that they're not as finding kind of like the situation is not as erotically charged. Therefore, that lead them to have some issues around performance or getting erection or maintaining an erection. And that can lead to this vicious cycle of they wanting to connect, they're not able to connect, like they're not able to get the arousal, and then they avoid sex.
Yeah, so that can lead to what we often refer to as situational erectile dysfunction. Like you can't get erect with this one partner or in this one type of situation, but you can still get erect in other situations. So, for example, a lot of men who have erectile difficulties, they can get an erection totally fine during masturbation and self-pleasure. But when it comes to sex with their partner, that's something different. And oftentimes that stems from this loss of erotic polarity in the relationship, where there's something about that dynamic in the relationship that you have with your partner that triggers something mentally that makes it hard, pun intended, makes it hard to become aroused and to stay aroused in situations like that. So, yeah, I mean, as we've discussed, erectile dysfunction is this very complex biopsychosocial phenomenon. Of course, you've got physical health factors that play a role, but as we've been discussing, there's lots of psychological and relational factors that play a big role in this as well. So when we're talking about how do we treat and deal with erectile difficulties, it's kind of a complicated thing because there are so many different potential contributing factors. Now, before we get into talking a little bit about how we should go about treating and dealing with these issues, I wanted to get your take on something, which is that I've seen some emerging evidence that erectile dysfunction seems to be increasing in young men. And we see that, there's a rise in young guys who are taking Viagra and these other ED drugs. But is this because they're actually having more erectile dysfunction, or is it because they're having the sexual disappointments and they're just interpreting that as ED when it really doesn't rise to kind of the clinical threshold there? So what's your thought in terms of why more younger people seem to be reporting difficulties around erectile function?
What's interesting is that in order for us to be able to build confidence in partner experiences, the key is for us to have opportunities to have those experiences. And in this time and age, with using like even medication, our reliance on medication, we don't give ourselves opportunities to experience those setbacks and build skill set to improve it. I see that with lots of my clients with social anxiety, right? This time and age, we used to say, if you have social anxiety, the treatment is exposure. You're going out there, talking to people, but now people connecting more via technology. So they don't have the same level of opportunities for exposure. I can see that that is a similar challenge with younger people struggling with erectile unpredictability or erectile dysfunction, because developmentally, it can be appropriate for you to experience some nervousness, some challenges. But when you are experiencing that and you will have quote unquote successful experiences, you build that muscle that I got this. It's normal for me to feel uncomfortable. I got it. But when you're taking medication or avoiding those situations, in a way, you are activating that negative feedback that gets in the way of you building the sexual confidence, which is a big part of being able to function well in sexual experiences with others.
Yeah. And I think in talking about, erectile difficulties and unpredictability in younger men, again, this is something that a lot of people like to blame on porn, but it's such a complex phenomenon. And I think not enough attention is paid to things like the fact that young adults have pretty high rates of being on antidepressants and other medications for which erectile difficulties and dysfunction can actually be a very common side effect. And so it's a complex, multifaceted thing. And again, it just goes back to when we try to blame it all on porn, that's not really the right answer. So in terms of dealing with erectile dysfunction, medication increasingly is the first line of defense. And as we've discussed, it's become very easy to access, and people like it because taking a pill is simple and it works quickly. But pills don't address the underlying psychological causes like attachment wounds or or loss of erotic polarity. So talk to us a little bit about the benefits of sex therapy for ED and how it can help to address the root causes and provide a more lasting solution.
Similar to what you described, I don't think there's anything wrong with using medication or even people use testosterone. All of those things can be adjunctive, supportive of your physiological optimization. But for many people, like sometimes the challenges is because of our individual mental health challenges. Maybe we're feeling anxious or it's depression, and we need tools and strategies to manage those emotions, whether it's learning emotional regulation strategies. There are some people think that resilient people have good genes. Maybe, but in reality, there are so many techniques and strategies that you can use to manage your nervous system. If you have had previous trauma or have difficulties upbringing, it doesn't mean that you will not be able to have a regulated nervous system. So in therapy, sometimes people learn those strategies for emotional regulation. And when you are able to change your nervous system from this place of fight and flight and freeze to rest and digest, that can be a game changer for you during sex. So partly could be learning strategies to change your thoughts, therefore changing your emotion. The other part, it helps you to understand that in a relational component, what are some of those beliefs that you have? What are some of those early childhood experiences that led you to have attachment challenges? And with understanding those things, you will learn to identify the pattern. Right. The kind of like it can help you to also shift from avoidant attachment style to leaning toward more secure attachment style. That can also not only change your sex life, it can change how you do life with doing relationships better. So that also can be very helpful. And also the other part is that oftentimes couples come into me because of their erectile, like one partner's erectile difficulties, and they feel that they're disconnected from sex for years. But when you go to sex therapy, they can help you to how to have a firm erection. That's something that we have manualized treatment and strategies and evidence-based practices, but also it can help you to open the door to have better, more meaningful sex that would be energizing for you and your partner. Because in reality, many people have penis, vagina sex, the intercourse sex, and just not exciting for them. And going through sex therapy can help them. What kind of sexual experiences can be exciting for them? Therefore, they would be more motivated to have better sexual experiences.
Yeah, I love everything you just described there. And I think it speaks to this really important misconception about ED meds, which is that they give you automatic, like instantaneous erections, and they don't, right? There still needs to be stimulation and turn-ons and arousal and all these other things to happen. And so, yeah, you can take the med and it can make it easier for you to get an erection. But if you're not really into the sex that you're having, it's not going to be a perfect solution for that. Or if you have these attachment issues and anxiety and insecurity, those issues are still going to pop up during sex, right? So that's where the medication alone isn't enough when you've got like these deeper underlying psychological issues. And working with a sex therapist can help you to build up the skills that you need. And, you know, the medication can still be there to augment things, but working on this psychologically can really provide a more lasting solution. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Nazanin. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. They can go to sexologypodcast.com. They can find all of my information there, and they can check out my podcast. It's called Sexology Podcast, wherever they listen to shows.
Great. And I'll be sure to include links to that in the show notes. Thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.